ready to go deeper than the headlines.
Absolutely.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into how media shapes our world through the lens of the Westminster School.
It's a fascinating approach.
It really is. And, this isn't just some obscure academic theory. It's about understanding those subtle, often invisible forces that shape what we see, hear, and read every single day.
Yes. It's about looking beyond the surface, asking not just, what does this message mean, but why was this message created in the first place?
Mhm.
And who benefits?
Exactly. It's like peeking behind the curtain to see who's pulling the levers. Now, our guide for this deep dive is the work of James Curran. He's a leading voice in the Westminster School. So, to set the stage, where did this all begin?
Well, picture London in the 1970s. It was a time of massive social and political change. And at the Polytechnic of Central London, which later became the University of Westminster, this incredible group of media scholars emerged. Many of them had actual hands-on experience in the media industry.
Oh, so they weren't just academics stuck in an ivory tower then.
Not at all. They were journalists, filmmakers, people who really understood how the media worked from the inside out. And they started to notice this gap. How media was being studied didn't quite line up with how it actually functioned in the real world.
Interesting. So they were seeing things that the traditional theories weren't capturing.
Precisely.
Yes.
They saw this need for a new approach, one that took into account the realities of media production, the political pressures, the economic interests.
So what did they do?
They took action. They launched the first ever media studies degree in Britain, which is a really big deal at the time. And a few years later, they founded the journal Media, Culture, and Society. Even today, it's still one of the most influential journals in the field.
Wow, they really hit the ground running. Now, one of the things that I find most interesting about the Westminster School is their perspective on the role of the state in the media. It's a bit more nuanced than you might expect. A lot of folks might assume that media scholars, especially back then, were automatically suspicious of any state involvement in media.
You're right. In the 70s, the dominant view, especially among left-leaning academics, was that the state was this big oppressive force that used media to maintain its own power.
Control the narrative.
Exactly. But the Westminster School, they started asking a different question. What if the state could actually be a force for good in media? What if it could be a tool for promoting media that served the public interest, rather than just propping up the powerful?
Instead of seeing the state as the enemy, they saw its potential. That's interesting.
And a key figure in this line of thinking was Nicholas Garnham. He was a major intellectual force in the Westminster School. Garnham started out with a pretty traditional Marxist view. The idea that the economic structure of a society determines everything else, including its culture and media.
So who owns the presses, controls the message, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But then Garnham, he had this fascinating evolution in his thinking. He began to question this whole base superstructure model, arguing that the relationship between economics, politics, and ideas was far more fluid and complex.
Okay, so what prompted that shift in his thinking?
Well, remember, Garnham wasn't just an academic. He had real-world experience in the media industry, and he saw firsthand how political pressures, cultural shifts, even individual personalities could influence what got made and how it was received. Things the base superstructure model just couldn't fully explain.
The messiness of reality versus the neatness of theory.
Exactly. And this is where he turns to the work of the philosopher Jürgen Habermas, specifically this idea of the public sphere.
Okay, public sphere. That's an important concept. Can you give us a quick rundown?
Of course. Imagine those 18th century coffee houses where people would gather to debate the big issues of the day. That was a real-life public sphere in action. A space separate from the state or the market where citizens could freely exchange ideas, and hopefully arrive at a more nuanced understanding of the issues.
So a space for open dialogue, reasoned debate, the kind of thing that ideally leads to a more informed public. Got it. But how does this relate back to media?
Well, Garnham saw public service broadcasting as a modern embodiment of this ideal. He argued that unlike commercial media, which is beholden to advertisers and shareholders, public service broadcasters, with their mission to inform, educate, and entertain, could provide the kind of diverse, high-quality programming necessary for a healthy and thriving public sphere.
So instead of trying to eliminate the state's role in media, Garnham is saying, hey, let's harness that power to create media that actually benefits the people.
Precisely. And this idea had a real impact on the Westminster School's approach to media policy. They weren't afraid to roll up their sleeves and get involved in the nitty-gritty of media regulation. In fact, they played a key role in the creation of Channel 4 in the UK.
Wow. Talk about putting ideas into action. Now, speaking of shaking things up, the Westminster School's work on market influence is where things get especially interesting for me. They coined this term market censorship, which I think is something a lot of people can relate to, even if they've never heard the term itself.
It's a powerful idea.
It is, and we'll dive into the nitty-gritty of market censorship when we come back. So we're back, ready to pull back the curtain on market censorship. It's a concept that the Westminster School really put on the map. What makes this idea so compelling, so relevant even?
Well, it challenges this notion that we have true freedom of choice when it comes to the media we consume. It forces us to consider the ways in which those choices might be more limited than we realize.
More illusory than real, like you said earlier. So how does this market censorship actually work? I mean, it's not like there's some guy in a suit sitting in an office somewhere saying, nope, you can't publish that book, or that film's not going to make us any money, scrap it, right?
Right. It's much more subtle, much more insidious. The Westminster School argues that it functions like a kind of invisible filter, shaping the media landscape in often unseen ways.
And what are the mechanics of this filter, this invisible hand, so to speak?
Profit. That's the driving force behind market censorship. In a market-driven system, media companies, they're businesses at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Your primary goal is to generate revenue, to please shareholders. And that creates certain incentives, certain pressures that inevitably shape the kind of content they produce.
So give us a concrete example of how this plays out, something our listeners can really connect with. Imagine we're scrolling through Netflix, trying to find something to watch tonight. How would this idea of market censorship be at play in that scenario?
Okay, so you're on Netflix, you're faced with this overwhelming amount of content, right? Hundreds, thousands of titles to choose from. But within that vast library, there are certain types of shows, certain genres, certain formulas that are much more likely to get the green light, to be heavily promoted, to rise to the top of those recommendation algorithms.
The big budget action flicks, the reality TV dramas, the familiar franchises that people already know and love, comfort food, basically.
Exactly, because those are seen as safe bets, lower risk. They have a built-in audience, which means they're more likely to generate profits. And again, this doesn't mean those shows are inherently bad, but it does create a system where risk-taking, originality, those can be stifled.
Because a documentary on a little-known social issue, even if it's incredibly well made, it's probably not going to get the same primetime slot as the latest Marvel movie.
Right. And that's just one small example. The Westminster School argued that this dynamic plays out across all forms of media. Take news coverage, for instance. We know that high-quality investigative journalism, the kind that holds the powerful to account, it's expensive and time-consuming.
And in today's fragmented media landscape where everyone's competing for clicks and eyeballs, it might not always attract a huge audience.
Exactly. And so in a market-driven media system, news outlets, they might be incentivized to focus on stories that are cheaper to produce, quicker to turn around, more likely to generate clicks and shares.
So we get more celebrity gossip, more sensationalized crime stories, more of those easily digestible news snippets that we consume on social media, the kind of stuff that grabs our attention, but maybe doesn't leave us feeling all that informed.
Exactly. And that's the danger that the Westminster School was warning us about. It creates this cycle, this feedback loop, where audiences become accustomed to a certain type of media diet, fast food, as we were saying. And media producers, they're incentivized to keep feeding that diet, even if it's not particularly good for us in the long run.
So what's the solution? Should we just reject the market entirely when it comes to media?
Well, it's not quite that simple. And to be fair to the Westminster School, they weren't all completely anti-market. Richard Collins, for example, who was a key figure in the school, he argued that in some cases, market forces could actually lead to greater diversity and innovation in media.
Oh, interesting. So it's not black and white.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Collins pointed to the rise of cable television in the U.S. as a prime example.
Yeah.
He argued that this increase in competition from all these new cable channels, it actually forced the established networks to become more responsive to the diverse needs and interests of viewers.
So competition, in some cases, can actually be a good thing.
It can be, absolutely. But the key takeaway here is that the Westminster School, even when they were acknowledging the potential benefits of market forces, they always urged us to be critical, to recognize those potential downsides, those unintended consequences.
To understand that just because something's popular or profitable doesn't mean it's good for us individually or for society as a whole. They wanted us to be savvy media consumers, to understand how the game is played.
Exactly. And for them, a huge part of that was understanding media history.
Because to understand the present, you have to understand the past, right? You have to know how we got here.
Precisely. And the Westminster School, they weren't interested in just writing these dry institutional histories of media organizations.
Right.
They were digging deeper. They wanted to understand how those institutions were shaped by, and in turn helped to shape broader social, political, and economic forces.
So instead of just asking, what did the BBC do? They were asking, why did the BBC become the BBC we know today? What kind of picture emerged when they took that approach, that historical approach?
Well, their work on British media history is full of incredible insights. For example, they did this fascinating deep dive into the history of the BBC, showing how its development as an institution wasn't just about, like, the technology of radio or the specific personalities involved.
Right.
It was deeply intertwined with the rise of British nationalism, the growth of the welfare state, the evolving role of the government in shaping public opinion, all these bigger historical and cultural currents that were swirling around at the time.
It's all connected.
Exactly. And that's a recurring theme in the Westminster School's work. They looked at everything from the impact of market forces on the British film industry to the development of seemingly unrelated communication technologies like the telephone and the electric light. They saw connections everywhere.
Always trying to understand the bigger picture.
Always. And they were really ahead of their time in recognizing that technology, it's never neutral.
Right. It's not just about the technology itself. It's about who has access to it, who controls it, and for what purposes.
Precisely. And that actually brings us to another area where the Westminster School was incredibly prescient. Their work on new communication technologies and the internet. And keep in mind, this was the 80s and 90s, long before the days of social media and smartphones as we know them.
It's amazing how much they got right, how relevant their thinking is even now.
It really is. And while a lot of folks back then were getting swept up in this whole utopian vision of the internet, you know, the idea that it was this great equalizer, this information superhighway that was going to lead to a more democratic world.
The digital utopia.
The Westminster School, they were sounding a note of caution.
They weren't buying into the hype.
Not entirely. I mean, they were fascinated by the potential of this new technology, but they also recognized that tendency, that very human tendency, to look at technology as a magical solution to deeply rooted social and political problems.
The idea that if we just get the tech right, everything else will fall into place.
Right, and they knew it was much more complicated than that. So instead of getting caught up in those utopian visions of a digitally connected world, they were asking the tough questions. Questions about power dynamics online, about access, about control in this new digital age.
Questions that are even more relevant now than they were back then, I'd say.
Absolutely. And that's what makes the Westminster School's work so enduringly important, so valuable. They didn't just give us a bunch of answers. They gave us a framework for thinking critically about media in all its forms, a framework that helps us cut through the noise and understand the forces, both visible and invisible, that are shaping our world, our perceptions, our realities.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the nuances of market censorship, the importance of a historical perspective, those prescient warnings about technology. But how does this all come together? What's the takeaway for our listeners? We've been on quite a journey with this deep dive, haven't we?
Yeah.
From the streets of 1970s London to those big, enduring questions about media, power, and technology.
It's fascinating how much the Westminster School's work still resonates today.
Absolutely. So as we wrap things up here, I want to bring it all home. We've explored those often hidden gears of media power, the influences that shape the information we encounter every day. What does it all mean for us as individuals navigating this incredibly complex media landscape?
It's the big question, isn't it? And I think the Westminster School would say it's less about having all the answers and more about knowing which questions to ask.
Being critical consumers of media, not just passive sponges soaking it all up.
Exactly. Paying attention not just to what we're seeing and hearing, but how it's being presented and, crucially, why.
Asking, who created this? What are their motivations? Who benefits if I see the world this way?
Exactly. And it's about actively seeking out a diversity of perspectives, challenging our own assumptions, being aware of those echo chambers, especially online, where we only encounter information that reinforces what we already believe.
We've got to be mindful of that.
Absolutely. And here's another key point. The Westminster School, they remind us that we're not just passive recipients of media messages. We have agency.
We're not powerless.
Not at all. We have choices. We can choose what we consume, what we support with our time and attention. We can seek out and amplify those media voices that align with our values. We can engage in thoughtful conversations about media's role in society.
So it's about being conscious, being critical, but also being engaged. It's not about opting out, it's about actively shaping the kind of media ecosystem we want to see.
Precisely. And it goes back to that idea of the public sphere we talked about earlier, that space for reasoned debate, for exchanging ideas, for cultivating a well-informed public, which is so crucial for any healthy democracy. The Westminster School really highlights the vital role that media plays in shaping that public sphere, for better or for worse.
And each of us has a part to play in that process. It's about recognizing that the stories we tell, the information we choose to share, the media we consume, these aren't just passive choices, they're acts of participation. We're all shaping this shared reality.
That's a powerful way to put it. It's about understanding that we have the power to influence the media landscape, one choice, one conversation, one click at a time.
I love that. So, as we go about our day to day, as we encounter different forms of media, let's carry these insights with us. Let's ask those tough questions, challenge our own assumptions, and remember that we have a role to play in making media more responsible, more responsive, more representative of the world we want to live in. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.